Nicholas Joe served as Cultural Counsellor at the Australian Embassy in Beijing. 4 of his novels, including Paper Nautilus, have been translated into Chinese. He talks about his life and career with Pookong Kee, the immediate past BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University and Emeritus Professor at the University of Melbourne. The Foundation for Australian Studies in China acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which this interview was conducted.
Welcome, Nick, to the Australian Studies in China online resource conversations. You have a long and deep involvement with China. Can you please share with us your first interest in China and how has that interest developed over time?
Thank you, Pookong. Well, it's nice to join you here in this conversation. And that question, well, it takes me right back to my student days. I did my undergraduate study at the Australian National University in Canberra, which was one of the main universities to offer Chinese at that time as a language study. But for some reason, I didn't do it. I did English instead, and my interest was in English literature. And that led to me going to Oxford to do my doctorate. But while I was in Oxford, I began to think about my future. And I thought the future for me as an Australian would involve China. And that was in the 1970s. And it was a kind of an unusual idea to have, but I did believe that. And I had a friend at Oxford, an American friend who was studying Chinese, classical Chinese. And he said, yes, of course you must study Chinese. You can't call yourself a citizen of the world unless you can speak Chinese. And I thought, well, maybe that's true. There's something in that. But it was impossible to study Chinese at Oxford. So when I went back to Australia, I was teaching. I was a lecturer in English literature back at the Australian National University. But I enrolled then in a Chinese language course at the Canberra College of Advanced Education, which is now the University of Canberra, where there were small classes training people who would be Australian diplomats in Chinese language. And we had wonderful teachers there, brilliant teachers and small classes. And I did this at night school, really. I made very, very slow progress because I had my day job, my other work. But I was absolutely fascinated by the language. I loved what I was learning. And I wanted to go to China at the first opportunity. So I went with a student group from that University of Canberra to China initially. That was in 1983. And I could feel what was happening in China. You know, there was this immense sense of change and of opening up and of recovery after the Cultural Revolution. And at that time, I also started thinking again about Australia's relationship with China, not just what was going to happen, but what had happened in the past, going back to the gold rushes, but more particularly the White Australia policy and the interaction between China and Australia through the 20th century. And at this stage, I also became aware that my own grandfather was born in China, in Ningbo, and his father, so my great-grandfather, had been a missionary to China in the 1890s. And he had actually spoken Chinese, was able to speak and read Chinese, and had told me a lot of stories when I was a child. I mean, he died when I was a child, but I was old enough to remember him quite vividly and to remember his stories, and then the stories that my grandfather and his wife had heard from him. And I had not really thought of this until that point, but I then made this connection between people like my great-grandfather and my grandfather born in China, who were Australians at an earlier point in Chinese history. And so this continuing connection of different kinds Some of it is well known, other parts of it are not so well known. But I thought this was something that I could write about. But I also wanted to go to China and I wanted to teach in China. So that's how it happened that I first came to Beijing in 1986. My Chinese language was very, very basic, but I spent so much time going out and talking to people, and I found myself a teacher. And then at the end of 1987, I started working at the Australian Embassy, and we couldn't afford an interpreter, so I was just sent out to do my own interpreting in all of the discussions, and so I had to learn quite fast.
There's a lovely story, and I think perhaps material for another novel on your grandfather and great-grandfather. Have you been back to Ningbo where they lived?
Yes, I went there, first of all, in 1986 by myself as a tourist. And at that point, it was very difficult to get there. He was born in Ningbo in a hospital, but they lived in a smaller town in Zhejiang province on the coast called Linhai. And that was really off limits to foreigners at that time, but I did manage to go there in 1986. But then I went back in 1990 with some other family members, and we met local officials. And some of my great-grandfather, although he was a missionary, he was trained actually as an engineer, and some of the buildings that he had built, the hospital for one, were still there, or are still there. And I went back again more recently, about 5 years ago. It's a very prosperous area of China now, as you know, and there is some memorial in one of the buildings to my great-grandfather, because my Chinese name is Zhou Si, which was the same name that he had. I have his Chinese passport from the 1890s, and it has the same name on it.
Talking about missionary, I think it was in your book, Chinese Whispers, where you mentioned about a Queenslander who went to the southwest and, devoted his entire life for the welfare of the villagers. And after he died, they regarded him as sacred to their community.
Yes, that's an incredible story. The Chinese writer Sang Ye, who lives in Brisbane, he uncovered that story of that man from Queensland, I think from Ipswich, actually, if I remember correctly. Yes, he worked with, it was a minority people, the E people he worked with for all that time, and I think even helped put their language into a written form.
Many more novels and materials for you and for other writers, both in China and in Australia.
Indeed, yes.
What has China meant to you as an author, and how has this been reflected in your writings?
China has played a big part in my life in various ways, but particularly as a writer. I've written 3 novels that relate directly to China, past and present. Well, the present at the time I was writing the novels, and I've written some short stories and many essays to do with China. But a lot of the writing also relates to Australia and connections between China and Australia, and between people from China and from Australia over time. China has stimulated me and inspired me as a writer. Why? I'm going to quote one of my teachers here, Pierre Rickmans, because China is a world. It's a civilization. It's a way of living. It's so rich in art and thought, and the contribution of China to the world, to human achievement, is endless. And in my own lifetime, the story of China and of Chinese people has been extraordinary. When I say my lifetime, I'm speaking really of the last 50 years or so. The story of China has been extraordinary. So this is something very inspiring to write about, very interesting to think about. And in my writing, I hope to communicate some of that to readers outside China.
Having lived in China in the 1980s, can you share some of your personal highlights from back then? And how do you see China has positively developed since that point?
Well, that's a very good question. The 1980s is a long time ago now, and it's a very long time ago for China. I mean, the great thing for me when I was here in the 1980s was that I was able to get to know a group of people, young people mostly, but who were writers and artists and thinkers. And in the middle and late 1980s, they were producing very powerful new work, full of ideas about China, where China would go for their particular generation. And it was a very exciting time. Some of those people went on to achieve a high level of recognition. So I was very fortunate to know them at this formative time in their lives. For example, there started to be art exhibitions that were open to the public in all sorts of venues. And I would always go to them in the late 1980s. And the highlight of all of that was the China Avant-Garde exhibition, which took place in the main art gallery in Beijing in February of 1989. It was an extraordinary exhibition, and many of those works from that exhibition subsequently toured internationally, and including to Australia, and some of the artists went on to become world famous. So it was very exciting to be part of the beginnings of that contemporary art movement in the 1980s. So that's one of my strong memories of that time. China and Beijing were very different from how they are now. And when I talk to young people in China now, they can't really believe how it was. I mean, among the biggest changes is the communication technology. Now, that's been a worldwide phenomenon since that time, with the arrival of mobile phones and internet. But in China, that was a very dramatic change. In the 1980s, very few people had a telephone at home. There were no mobile phones, certainly, but even to have one phone in the building where you lived was unusual. So communication took a completely different form. And in the case of China, that change of the communication technology has gone along with social changes of other kinds, particularly access to information. Magazines, books, and information generally has changed enormously since the 1980s. And if we go back to the artists I'm talking about from the 1980s, it was very difficult for them to get material about contemporary art from outside China. Partly they didn't know about it, partly there were not the channels to get it, and partly it was very expensive to buy a book or a magazine of contemporary art. Whereas now all of that has changed utterly. If you want something like that, you can just get it delivered by a courier. It's easy. Or you can look at magazines, online in many cases. So that's just a tremendous change from that time to now. There are other things related to that in terms of the general sort of standard of living in the cities particularly, but I think you get the idea.
And your time was mostly spent in Shanghai and Beijing, where I suppose, the creativity and the growth of our new ideas were most apparent.
That's true. In my first year in that period in 1986, I taught at the Beijing Foreign Studies University. And then in the next year, I taught in Shanghai at East China Normal University. And at both those universities, I taught undergraduates, but I also taught graduates. And many of the graduates, when they graduated, went back to the regions they came from to become teachers, university teachers very often. One of the very meaningful things for me was to go and visit them later in their different places. I remember going to Luoyang once, to the Luoyang Foreign Studies University to see one of my former students, and another time going to Nanchang in the south. And I saw then how different the conditions were across China. And in terms of the availability of books, my student in Nanchang, who was a very brilliant student, and he was mature age actually. So he'd come to Beijing to do a kind of refresher course. And I was able to take a few books along when I visited, and even that was a major difference at the time for his program. But it's true that the difference between the city and the country, to put it in simple terms, it was huge in the 1980s, and I suspect it's still quite huge now.
Nick, in the area of literature, can you give us a couple of examples of the most significant connections between Australia and China?
I'd start here with the Australian studies programs in China. They started in the 1980s, and there were a small number of Australian studies programs. And since then, they've spread and grown in number, and there are many of them all across China. But generally, those programs have a literature component, and quite often the professors in those programs come from a literature background. That was certainly the case when it began in the 1980s. And so they and their students, and particularly their graduate students, are able to read Australian literature in English and study it and very often translate it, and also help to get it published in magazines and in books. So that group of people over the 40 years or so, 30 years that we're talking about have been very active and have grown in number. And there are several generations we're talking about now. So the number of Australian books that have been translated and published in China has gone from really a tiny handful to hundreds. And that's a major development. So I think that would be the number one development for Australian literature in China, that there's a critical mass of books available, there's a readership that is informed, and there's a market for these books. And a market has developed. It's not only an academic undertaking, it also, has a market dimension, a commercial dimension with publishing. So that's important. Going along with that has been a great increase of knowledge about Australia among Chinese people. Back in the 1980s, it was not unusual to meet someone who didn't know the difference between Albania and Australia, and they were often confused. It was very limited knowledge about Australia, really. And that has changed a lot over the time, partly because of these new communication technologies we're talking about, and radio and television have been important in that too, the media, but also because so many people from China have visited Australia over the years or have some connection, personal connection to Australia. So there's a much greater background of knowledge. And so that helps with the literature too, because people are interested to read books about this country. They have some basic understanding of the country, and so that makes the books more accessible. Part of the visitors from China to Australia, I think this is significant. I mean, again, it's a big change from the 1980s that it's much easier for Chinese people to leave China now and come to Australia for a visit or for study or even for long term. I mean, that was very, very difficult in the 1980s. Now it's quite routine. And part of that process is that it has been easier for Chinese writers to visit Australia too. And most Australian literature festivals have hosted Chinese novelists and poets and other writers over the years, and work by Chinese writers has been translated into English and is read by Australian audiences. And through all of that process, Australian writers and Chinese writers have come to know each other. And this has helped the interest in literature in both directions. And I'll mention one example here, and that is the case of the Australian author Alexis Wright. So she is an Aboriginal Australian writer, and her novel Carpentaria, which has won many awards, has been translated into Chinese by Professor Li Yao and published. And through this, Alexis Wright has come to know the Chinese author ally who has Tibetan background, and he is very interested in Alexis Wright and her work and her book. And he wrote a wonderful review of her book in a Chinese literary magazine, saying it's one of the books that we really need these days. So they've developed quite a special relationship through all of this. And I think that's another example of the kind of development that's happened with Australian literature in these years.
Be sure to watch part 2 of our interview with Nicholas Jose, or browse through our entire collection of conversations.